Hey everyone, Jay from the St. Balthasar University English Club here. This is the third and for now final installment of a series where I critique listener-submitted poems. If you're interested, you can go check out the previous two episodes linked in the description below, but it's certainly not a requirement. As I said, this will be the last one in the series for now. Future episodes coming at a pending date. I have some other projects in mind that feel a little bit more urgent, and I want to make sure that I'm able to dedicate as much time as I possibly can to listener-submitted poems. If your poem wasn't selected in this or any of the previous rounds, don't worry. You're always welcome to submit again, even submit the same poem again if you like, and I'd like you to know that I read every single poem and considered every single poem with care. Part of the decision-making process has to do with how well I think the poems fit together. I don't want to pick several poems where I'm going to end up repeating the same critiques over and over again, so it might just be the case that you happen to submit a poem where my feedback to you would have been very similar to my feedback on another poem, and that's why it wasn't picked. Either way, thank you again for submitting. I admire your passion for the craft of poetry. There aren't enough people like you in the world, and I hope, from the bottom of my heart, that you'll keep writing, and that even if none of your poems were critiqued in this or either of the previous two videos, you'll find something in my critiques of other people's poems that will be valuable in your own writing. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Today we're kicking things off with an ekphrastic piece. Here it is. Setting a good corner, allegory and metaphor. What is recording but that which makes you exposed and vulnerable? Layers upon layers of video compression, one part death rattle of privacy, one part calling card from a peeping Tom, endlessly repeatable, utterly facile, all-consumingly captivating. Tertiary sources have assured me that Bruce has claimed that he might be thinking of possibly setting a good time machine and traveling back to blow the fucking brains out of whoever invented the VHS tape, the world's most corrupting and permanent invention right behind gunpowder. I know he means it because I can see it. He has no reason to lie. A recording is as all-powerful as it is pathetic. Video can't possibly be a boogeyman because I'm afraid of it, and I think it's true. And if I was just making the viciousness of the obsession of the camera up, I wouldn't have stared at this tape for the whole 2 hours. Recording something is as easy as snuffing out a cigarette, and just as freeing. For anyone not in the know, an ekphrastic poem is simply one that responds to another piece of media, usually a visual piece of media, as is the case with this poem, but that isn't strictly always true. In this specific instance, the piece is a 1 hour-ish loop of an artist recording himself setting up fence posts on his ranch. The first line, by virtue of its eye-catching enjambment, invites for me a reading in which the poem is going to explore whether video recordings have the power to quote-unquote create us. In what sense, we don't yet know, but a few possibilities spring to mind. Maybe the recorded versions of ourselves are more artificial according to the poem, or maybe, given the context of the specific artwork on which the poem is based, the recorded versions are more attentive to daily tasks or more meditative, something along those lines. The rest of the stanza, though, moves in a slightly different direction, characterizing video recordings as the end of privacy and the beginning of a kind of cultural voyeurism, which the poem describes playfully as a, quote, calling card from a peeping Tom, leading me to think that maybe the poem isn't taking this violation of privacy too seriously. The stanza ends in 3 additional descriptions of video, that being repeatable, facile, and captivating. I'm slightly unsure why these 3 descriptions were picked, why in this order, and why here. The associative jumps into and out of the list, as well as within the sequence itself, are a little hard for me to follow. To me, these 3 descriptors almost read like the background philosophy that may have inspired the poem, and I'm not quite sure if they need to be present in the text itself. I think the poem can show us these 3 aspects of video throughout its duration, rather than listing them all in one place here. There's this interesting sinister element that enters the tone in the second stanza, and it's infused with the aforementioned playfulness to create something edgy, and I mean that in a very positive way. The speaker compares recorded video to guns, not necessarily in the sense that both are violent, but in the sense that both shift the balance of power once one is in control of them. This is really interesting, and I would honestly like to know more about this comparison. I think it's kind of a shame that it comes and goes so quickly. Bruce, who is mentioned in this stanza, is the artist behind the piece that the poem is based on, and this is a slight source of confusion for me. I'm not fully sure why he's invoked as the person who seemingly wants to destroy video in the poem. From a little preliminary reading, the artwork, Setting a Good Corner, seems to be about finding the meditative qualities of otherwise pedestrian activities, or I guess I could just say chores if I felt like being normal, mediated by the length of the videotape and its unflinching view of every step of Bruce's fence post inserting process. As far as I can tell, the video doesn't have much to do with the frustrations that the poem directs at the medium of video, but it's entirely possible I'm missing some kind of context here, so some kind of clarification or maybe a reworking of this angle of the poem could be beneficial. Something really interesting happens in stanza 3, though. The speaker seems to be projecting their own obsession onto the camera, stating, "If I was just making the viciousness of the obsession of the camera up, I wouldn't have stared at this tape for the whole 2 hours." It's a little unclear to me if the speaker themselves is aware of this projection, if the poem would like us to read this as projection at all, and if so, if the poem would like us to read the speaker as aware or unaware of their own projection. Unrelatedly, but also interestingly, the stanza contains the only comma, the only piece of punctuation at all, in the entire poem. This leaves me wondering, why here, and why a comma? Does that suggest anything? I wasn't able to pick a particular meaning out of it, but if so, I would be interested in knowing what it is. The fourth and final stanza concludes on a really thrilling simile. There's something almost brutal about it, the image of snuffing out a cigarette. While I'm not sure that this is the optimal moment to include this line, I'm extremely in favor of reincorporating it elsewhere into the poem, rather than cutting it all together. Moving from the end of the poem back up to the beginning, I want to talk really quickly about title. I think that I would suggest changing the title to make room for more information, meaning that if the title of the inspiring work was included at a dedication after the title or at the end of the poem, we would have then freed up the space of the title to give us some contextualizing data that might be useful in helping the reader understand exactly how the speaker of the poem would like us to understand video as a medium. Looking at the poem more broadly, I'm interested in the choice to use all lowercase. I'll level with you guys. Writing a poem in all lowercase is not something I'm usually very good at parsing the intention behind. I have heard people explain it in a number of ways. Often they will say it's meant to invoke a sense of quiet or attempt to heighten intimacy, or maybe suggest a diminishment of the speaker, especially in the case of writing a lowercase I, but I'm not really sure if any of these common explanations really fit this poem or relate especially to ekphrasis or to the video on which the poem is based. But I also associate all lowercase, especially with Instapoetry, an association that I'm well aware not everyone shares, so my bias might be affecting my ability to assess this decision accurately. I would be curious what other reasons people are familiar with for writing poems in all lowercase. Please feel free to drop those in the comments below. Some crowdsourced data on this might actually be really helpful for me. On the whole, there are lots of really good ideas in this poem, recording as maybe the greatest form of intimacy, which is both beautiful and potentially dangerous because of the vulnerability it implies, recording as obsessive VHS as a source of loathing or as being easily abused. Again, all of these ideas are fantastic and they are in the orbit of the poem, but I'm wondering which of these ideas, if any, is primary. I'm wondering which one deserves the most focus. Someone that I used to be in a workshop with liked to compare poems to movies and would often say that a good poem mimics the focus of a well-directed camera, capturing only the most essential elements. Sure, there is an entire world implied to exist behind every shot, but that's all just context. What matters right now, what is most immediate, is what the camera shows us. My question is, which idea does the poem want to put right in front of its reader? The other ideas can be expanded upon and deserve to be expanded upon, frankly, in future poems. Thanks so much for this poem, Prudence. It was a great joy to work with it. Next up, we have a poem called Easter Brunch. Easter Brunch. It's April. It's surely green. And it all blossomed from last night's dark and cold, and you, in my room, a strong wind was last night, and as the window inhaled the door made love to the frame, you were quite next to me, remember, wake to the surely green and a likely spring. Bird, now I have my coffee, and it's spring inside as well. As with the previous poem, this one ends on a very precise image. I've heard this technique called an exit image, though I don't know if there's a better term or even where that term particularly originates, unfortunately. One thing that's for sure, though, is that it's certainly not from James Longenbach's The Art of the Poetic Line, which I'm not going to be mentioning for the duration of this episode. In any case, I think that the exit image works really well in this poem because it reflects the image on which we opened, but is recontextualized by the presence of the lover who we didn't know about when we initially encountered the image on a first read. As in fiction, the stakes have changed, and that's good. One suggestion I have here is to maybe remove the line break separating the exit image from the rest of the poem. I think it draws a little too much attention to the technique of the exit image itself, which isn't necessarily beneficial to the poem. There are certainly cases where being able to trace back the specific craft decisions which a poem makes are useful, but I don't know that this is one of those instances. Something else this poem has in common with the previous one is the implementation of this all lowercase typography. If this is intended to invoke the quiet that I mentioned earlier, or the intimacy, I can definitely track that rationally, but again, emotionally, for me, the association with insta-poetry is way stronger. I guess I just don't think the mutedness we're supposed to be getting from the lowercase, if I am correct, isn't already being evoked by the short lines, the speaker's measured tone, and the descriptions themselves. Maybe it's kind of like putting a hat on a hat, but at the same time I can very easily imagine another critiquer might say the opposite, that this lowercase is reinforcing what's already there, reminding us to read every single line with a sort of quiet, intimate intensity. Regardless, if we're going to do all lowercase, I think that we should commit to it, which might mean lowering the case of W in wake and dropping that I towards the end into lowercase as well, and also the title now that I think of it. Speaking of that word wake that appears near the end of the poem, this is the only instance we have of caesura beginning a line. Side note, I can absolutely see some poets contending that the one-word lines in this piece all end in caesuras in context because they are significantly shorter than the lines that precede them and also come after them. So where in a poem made up of lots and lots of one-word lines, each line wouldn't necessarily be said to end in caesura, but in a poem like this, where the relative brevity of one-word lines makes them caesura by contrast. I don't read them that way personally, but it's the kind of comment that I used to hear in workshop all the time, so I thought maybe it would be worth sharing with you. Either way, what happens right before the word wake is undeniably a caesura, and I'm curious as to why that is the only case of that happening. This means that for me, I don't really have enough information to read its significance as a craft decision. It takes 2 instances of something to create a parallel and 3 to establish a pattern. I'm wondering if there are other places you could include caesura where it might be doing the same thing or at least something similar to what you're intending to do with wake, so that as a reader, I'm more prepared to read this craft technique in the context of this poem. One narrative moment that really draws my attention is the question, remember. Not only because of the unconventional use of punctuation, but also because it implies the speaker is maybe worried that the beloved might forget the encounter. It adds an undercurrent of conflict, or potential conflict at least, to a poem that doesn't otherwise have any. And I think this is actually fantastic. It reminds the reader that there are stakes. The beloved and the speaker's relationship is not being taken for granted. There is at least a hint of risk. And for that reason, I think another instance of remember, maybe after in my room, would enhance this feeling for me. I don't think we need a third one in this case necessarily, since the goal isn't so much to establish any kind of formal pattern as much as to emphasize that there is danger in the poem, that there is something narrative happening in which the potential to go wrong is there. Thanks so much for sending this poem in, Spencer. I really enjoyed reading it. Second to last, we have a piece called To Break with the Ground. This poem comes with a content warning, so if you've only been listening to the video up until this point, look at the screen now to see what that content warning is. To break with the ground. A bird told me I could fly if I followed him. His black shape against blue skies drew my eyes upward, but roots would not wait for my downward gaze in the clearing. They would not stand in my way. The deer ceased their grazing to reject me with flight, for my footsteps, unsuspended, wrought chaos on the ground. One tree in the middle, with a noose on its branch, stood beneath a line where the sky met a cloud. The branch creaked and the noose swung when the wind conquered a moment, till it fell through its fingers and all was calm again. In its wake, the wind left leaves in new places, but the bird remained perched in the noose and sang. This poem continues our trend of moving into narrative in this episode, and I think that it is definitely the most narrative of the ones we're going to be looking at today, in that it chronicles a sequence of events in what I assume is chronological order. It might kind of sound dumb to say that out loud, like it's too obvious or something, but I do think it's worth keeping in mind when a poem does this, since it isn't the default. Whenever it happens, it makes sense to realize that it's happening, and as I'm about to do, I think map out the events so that we can trace their relationships to each other. First up, the speaker seems to be seeing a bird who promises the speaker the power of flight if she follows it. Then, I think, some roots try to trip the speaker up but are unsuccessful. Then we have some deer fleeing at the sound of the speaker's clumsy footfalls, and the speaker's encounter with a tree that has a noose hanging from it. This is where I start to lose the narrative a little bit, this part of the line, till it fell through its fingers. I think the first "it" is the moment, and the second "it" is the wind, so implying that the moment has moved on. It had stopped, but now it has resumed. Not 100% sure though, and for me it is not necessarily a productive uncertainty, so I might suggest some rewording there to make it a little bit clearer what exactly is happening. Then the bird quote-unquote remains in the noose, but I'm not 100% sure when it got there. And finally, it sings. I read this poem as an allegory or an extended metaphor, and I'm all but certain it has to do with a certain kind of ideation. The specifics are a little bit lost on me, and I think that speaks to the difficulty of writing poems that are pure metaphor. If the metaphor is too obscure, then the semantics suffer. A reader without knowledge external to the poem itself isn't really able to access the piece's intended meanings. This is something I plan to talk about in an upcoming video on Sylvia Plath, so stay tuned for that. On the other hand, if the thing that the metaphor is a metaphor for, which in poetry is called the tenor, is too obvious, the poem starts to take on a sort of fable-like quality, and that hasn't really been good in poems for about 200 years, so probably want to stay away from that. In my opinion, this poem is leaning a tad too far in the direction of the obscure, so the former of the two that I just mentioned. It's rooting itself very firmly in the realm of the metaphor without giving us much sense of the material substrate at which you would think the metaphor would be gesturing. I think that what we need here is a sense of what the real world is like relative to this poem, to put it in less wanky terms. The phrase, "the wind left leaves in new places," is absolutely stunning, and I think it should be on its own sentence, on its own line. It is specific, attentive, and grounding, and I think it would do a great job of giving us really firm soil from which to spring into the ending, which is a little bit more abstract. Speaking of abstract moments, the action in line 3 is also a little bit difficult to parse. I'm wondering why the root's desire to trip the speaker are placed in relation to the speaker's ability to see them. I think what's being suggested is that the speaker can or can't see them, and that in some way has to do with them being able to dodge the roots, but I'm sitting here thinking about things that I'm pretty sure the poem wants me to grasp right away and move on, so I would also consider rewording that just a little bit for the sake of clarity. Similarly, not too long after that, we have this word unsuspended. This is also somewhat difficult to parse, as in why the footsteps dynamism is being defined by a negative. So, for example, I'm wondering why the footsteps are being called unsuspended when the poem could instead be pointing our attention towards what it is they are hitting and in what way. Finally, let's talk about syntax really quickly. The lack of periods coupled with the end-stopped and parsing lines make the poem a little bit halting at times. I think I've used this metaphor of pulling a cord on a lawnmower repeatedly, and it feels that way just a little bit in places. So I think some of those annotating line breaks that are from a book whose name I will not say could be your friend here. Finally, I want to say that I really adore the title. I can see that there is lots of flight happening in this poem, lots of attempts to escape the ground, and I am curious about where that will go as this poem continues to see future drafts. Thanks for sending in this poem kit, and best of luck with all your edits. Last but not least, we have a poem called Sun Tea, which author Ib has let us know is based on an Appalachian tradition of allowing tea leaves to sit in a jar in the sun for a long time in order to brew. Sun Tea. I've been holed up on the top shelf since we last spoke. Spiders and dust have kissed my glass skin cloudy, while my dreams of you and summer drift in a snow globe haze to my feet. I used to pick my words at the peak of season, laced in more delicacy than air, but lately my bad choices don't rain, but pour in honey-dark ribbons from my mouth and eyes into litanies of cups I've raised against me. I'm a clogged fountain overflowing. I was supposed to be fresh squeezed by hand. The heart in a chokehold brings out that special pink twist, but I've been spoiled and left rotting in the light. I don't mean to be bitter when I say I don't think I was always distasteful. I only fester when brewed under bad-tempered glass, and tight lids tend to burst under pressure. But time springs trust perennial, and the season for sincerity shortens each year. I've spent too many unblinking days, begging the bright eyes overhead to turn these tears gold and burn lemon sweet again on my tongue as I speak, finally ripe. I will not bring my words to light, for them to sour like milk in the sun. So, I have somewhat complicated feelings as a critiquer about what it means in my position to say that I think a poem is done or nearly done. This is really true for all decisions that an artist makes about their own work, but somehow it feels even more true that the choice to decide that something is finished must be strictly in the hands of its creator. Simultaneously, I feel it would be a little bit dishonest not to let a critique partner know if I thought the work had basically arrived at what I perceived to be its intended destination. Originally, I had written out a whole bunch more stuff to say about this, but that's really the crux of it. I have two extremely small suggestions and one formal one that has the potential to be larger, but honestly not all that large, so don't worry too much about it. First is I would suggest changing the word dreams to memories in the first stanza. Memories are slightly more complete than dreams, pedantic though that may sound. I think they would help establish that this stuff that is being described really happened in the speaker's past and was not just imagined. Second, in the third line of the second stanza, I would get rid of one of the two buts. Either cut the first or replace the second with another similar word or phrase, maybe including rather, or do both of those things. Finally, I wonder about the use of quintets as the poem's most primary formal ordering mechanism. I was always taught that quintets are meant to feel sort of uneven or irregular, the same way that 5/4 time feels off-kilter to the average Western music listener. However, they have never really felt that way to me, and they especially don't feel that way after they have become the norm of the poem like 3 or 4 stanzas in. I wonder if we need stanzas of consistent length at all, or if the stanzas in this poem can ebb and flow in their length alongside the music and rhetoric of the piece. That is to say, a little bit more like paragraphs, just as long as the poem feels that they need to be. The quintets definitely are not a problem in any sense, but around the 4th stanza, I started to wonder if they are too neat, if we needed to mix up this pattern. Then again, maybe the point of them is that the speaker is trying to enforce a neatness on ideas that they find chaotic, and the reason they use quintets rather than the more standard quatrain is meant to indicate that they don't quite have the control over their thoughts and feelings that they would like to have. Whatever the case may be, this is a poem that seems to me to be very, very close to what it is that I perceive it intended to do. Thank you so much for sending this piece in, Ib, and I wish you all the best in whatever edits you choose to enact on it going forward. Well, that about does it for today. Thank you all again for coming to Club, and an extra special thank you to everyone who submitted poems throughout this series, whether or not they were accepted. Again, I read every single poem with care. I had lots of thoughts about every single one of them. but it just wouldn't have been feasible to critique every single one that I received. I hope that once I reopen the submission form in a few weeks or months, you will all be ready to submit again, maybe even with some updated versions of some of the poems we've seen previously. I would absolutely welcome that as well. Always great to see the same poem grow and change over time. I hope you all enjoyed club today as much as I did, and I'll see you around campus.